I'm Sam Reese, and today, or tonight, or maybe this morning, depending on where you're watching this from, I'm going to be talking to you a bit about my book, Blue Notes: Jazz, Literature, and Loneliness. So, I guess a little bit about me before I start things off. I'm a literary and music critic. I'm also a fiction writer and a teacher. I'm currently a lecturer at the University of York St John in the UK. I've got my first audience member, so I'll just say hello. Um, and I thought before I did my first reading from the book, I'd talk a little bit about its background, where it came from, um, and how I developed the particular angle that I took in this project. So I guess as a little bit of background, when I came to write Blue Notes, or even when I first started kind of doing a bit of research, I'd already published quite a bit on both literature and music, including in my first book, which was also published with the wonderful LSU Press. Um, and I'd been fascinated for a long time with the question of how and why writers chose to write about jazz. It's something that had been particularly of interest to me during my PhD when I'd been looking at some short story writers who've been really influenced by jazz. And I guess the turning point came for me when I was working on an article about Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel Invisible Man. Um, Quite apart from the way that it talks about jazz, Invisible Man is a really amazing novel and one that's really worth taking some time to read. But for me, the breakthrough came when I was focusing in on the way Ellison writes about Louis Armstrong. And I realized that the recurring theme, not just in Invisible Man, but across the other short stories and books that I'd been, had at the back of my mind, was that every time these writers were turning to think about jazz, they were connecting it in some way to the theme of loneliness. So after having this breakthrough, this light bulb moment, I went away with Louis Armstrong playing and turned to other books to back up my hunch to see whether this was something worth pursuing. And going through, the pile that I could make up from my books on my shelves, I found I was actually onto something. These writers were consistently using jazz as a way to think through this question of what it means to be alone. Now, they weren't all doing this in the same way. There was a really wide range of different responses to jazz in these books, and some of them were using musicians and writers as musicians and specific pieces of music quite simplistically. Others were doing things a bit more complex. So I was building up a diverse range of books and writers that I could be thinking about. But still, the project I was thinking about was probably going to be quite a simple one. It would basically have been looking at different ways that different writers repeated the same motif. Jazz is lonely. But as anybody who's listened to jazz knows, it's a much more complex and much more constructive form of music than just repeating the idea of loneliness again and again. And so I went back to my starting point. I went back to Invisible Man and thought a bit more about the way Ellison was using the figure of Louis Armstrong. And with Louis Armstrong playing, I thought about him as a musician. Now, obviously, Armstrong's a great person to spotlight. He is the quintessential figure of the soloist, particularly for people of Ellison's generation. And the soloist, as a figure, is kind of spotlighted anyway, right? You've got a musician who's standing out on their own, and they are alone. And this is how Ellison was using Armstrong as somebody who was, for better or worse, isolated on their own. But Armstrong wasn't just a superbly talented soloist. He wasn't just a musician on his own, although he could be sometimes. But he was also a band leader. And this goes for many of the great soloists as well. In fact, the figure of the soloist in jazz traditionally emerges out of a group performance, out of a dynamic conversation between multiple different musicians, where the solo is a moment of spotlighting that then returns to a larger piece of music. And it was really interesting for me that turning then to the scholarship, the jazz scholarship, to the musicology and the writing about jazz performance, it was really interesting to see how often jazz musicians, as well as theorists, used this image to think about the solo. The solo was part of a larger conversation. And so this left me with a really big question. Is something more going on in the writing about jazz too? Does this focus on loneliness and being alone hide, or is it the key to a larger conversation? And so this theme of conversation was something that I picked up in my research and ended up becoming a really important part of the way I structured Blue Notes. So along with thinking about the conversations that might be going on in writing about jazz, I also started to think about the conversation between jazz and literature more generally, because it's not just writers listening to jazz musicians. There's also a conversation going the other way as well. You only need to think about a figure like Sun Ra, who was a really prolific writer and who drew on poetry in his music, or somebody like Sonny Rollins, whose archives were recently added to the New York Public Library. There's a huge collection of writing spanning his entire life. So I started to think about how I could make this a project that didn't just look at writers, but also looked at music and musicians in the way that literature and music were speaking to each other, or specifically literature and jazz. Then, of course, I started to come up against the question of what I meant when I was talking about loneliness, because it's very easy to fall into quite kind of simplistic and trite discussions of, what loneliness is. But as, people will be particularly aware of at the moment under, lockdown conditions still going on in lots of parts of the world, at a time when the phrase social distancing is a regular part of our vocabulary, loneliness is a really complex experience, and it's something that even before the situation this year, sociologists and commentators were noting was proliferating at a really large rate across the world. So in the end, the book became a conversation between three bodies of research. On the one hand, there was the literary side of the research, where I was looking at early writers like Langston Hughes or Eudora Welty, who wrote really important early pieces of short fiction responding to jazz in the 30s and 40s. Right the way through to writers working at the end of the 20th century and in the 21st century, thinking about particularly people like Toni Morrison or the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami. The second body of research was the body of musicians turning to the form of writing. Now, I needed to find a way to make this something more manageable for me, and so I decided to focus specifically on jazz autobiography. I think there's been some important work on jazz writing over the last decade, and I needed to find a way that I could kind of make my contribution meaningful as well as significant. Then finally, the third body of research was the most contemporary and up-to-date research from psychology and sociology, looking at the experiences of loneliness. And this was really important, that my book wasn't just dealing with loneliness as a really vague concept, but there was actually pinning down what the differences were between different kinds of loneliness, and importantly, how understandings about loneliness had changed over time. If conversation was the theme that marked the way that writers and musicians were thinking about jazz, then stories and narrative marks the way that psychologists and sociologists alike think about loneliness. One of the most interesting bits of research that's been going on has been looking at how much experiences of loneliness are shaped by discourse, by narratives, by the ways that people hear loneliness being talked about, and the stories that they tell themselves about loneliness and what their individuality, isolation, solitude means to them. Now, obviously, this is somewhere where I had to be a bit careful not to overstep the claims that I was making, because as much as I was drawing on this research, and this is an interdisciplinary project, it also wasn't doing primary psychological or sociological studies. So I needed to just kind of find the right balance as I was going through. So to give you a taste of Blue Notes, I thought I'd start by just reading you the opening couple of pages. And that will give you, I guess, a sense of how I launched into this topic, but maybe a little bit of a sense of my approach in the book as well. So, introduction, Feeling Blue. Lonely Woman, the opening track of Ornette Coleman's breakthrough album of 1959, The Shape of Jazz to Come, never fails to move and unsettle me. The moaning, dissonant, often wandering conversation between Coleman's alto sax and Don Cherry's pocket cornet evokes isolation and sadness in such a beautiful, heart-rending way. And as Coleman would later recount in interviews, he composed the piece in an attempt to communicate what he saw as a communal loneliness, a feeling that he believed, almost paradoxically, joined people in a shared experience of isolation. He explained in one interview that he composed the piece while working in a department store in the early 1950s. Coming across a gallery during his lunch break, he saw, and I quote, "this white lady in a picture with the most shattering expression you could see on her face. In the background, there was everything you could imagine that was wealthy, all in her background, but she was so sad. And I said, oh my goodness, I understand this feeling. I've not experienced this wealth, but I understand the feeling. I went home and wrote Lonely Woman." Even if we haven't read this interview, even if we haven't heard the story or even Coleman's music, the narrative he recounts and the desired impact of his music are still more than familiar. Today, they're an almost integral part of the myth of jazz and the jazz musician. As a genre that encompasses an almost impossibly wide variety of expressions, jazz can of course evoke more than one affective state. It can be uplifting, joyous even, or loaded with political protest. It can ask you to get up and dance or take to the streets. But more than any other emotion, the feeling Coleman described, a shattering sense of loneliness, is consistently associated with jazz. Indeed, jazz occupies a privileged cultural position, particularly in the United States, as a form of expression that allows its audience to transcend their own sense of being alone through a performance of one individual's deeply felt and keenly expressed solitude and pain. From the start, it is important to recognize that what I've just described is just that, a story, a narrative about the power of jazz that has wide cultural power, even if it elides so many of the ways that jazz has been performed and experienced. It is an imaginative capital that has been richly mined by writers whose literary representations of jazz have consistently drawn on both the imagery of the jazz genius and the stylistic qualities of jazz. Think about improvisation, syncopation, a non-linear structure characterized by riffs, and ongoing tension between soloist and group. To try and explore the limits of human loneliness. In the world of fiction, jazz can offer pathways for negotiating loneliness or new perspectives that can allow solitude to be seen as a positive, life-affirming experience. I've set out to map this relationship between jazz, loneliness, and literature through a perspective that jazz musicians regularly call upon to characterize their own performances, that of the conversation. Even from the first hesitant sketches of this project, I've understood that I wanted to trace the history of literary appropriations of jazz, both as subject matter and as an aesthetic system, in order to show how different kinds of writers have turned to jazz to explore different aspects of loneliness. As such, the following chapters unpack how writers have used the expansive possibilities of nonlinear novels or adapted the minor aesthetics of the short story to fit conceptualizations of jazz as form for exploring loneliness. At the same time, these chapters look at a range of different subject positions, from African American to Japanese, female to indigenous, with an attention to how the cultural tropes and symbolic potential of the jazz musician are used to parallel the often subjective pains of being cut off from others. But a one-way conversation is rarely constructive, and in a world replete with artistic cross-pollination, it is clear that musicians have been just as receptive to writing as authors have been to their sounds. Jazz musicians have often turned to literature for inspiration, sometimes obliquely, sometimes at the center of their work. But they've also used the written word as a way to concretely express something to which their music can only allude, or to which they must otherwise effectively evoke. In doing so, they mirror the turn by authors toward instrumental music, a form of communication that is abstracted from the language that is their chief resource. In analysing these exchanges, I try at once to refine and expand the cultural meaning of loneliness. This study is energised by my own belief that, however painful and isolating it may feel, loneliness can also create beauty, empathy, and understanding. So, to give you a sense of the remaining structure of the book, before I open it up to some questions, I thought I'd just give you a sketch of the remaining chapters. So, the first chapter, in a minor key, focuses on the specific form of the short story. If anybody's familiar with my work as a fiction writer or some of my earlier criticism, you'll know that I've spent a lot of time focusing particularly on short forms. And it seems really significant that the first body of writing to really deal with jazz was the American short story, much more so than the novels, particularly the novels of the jazz age, which, like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, really only bring in jazz to try and kind of set the mood rather than dealing with it in any substantial, thematic, or structural way. The second chapter takes its name from that same Ornette Coleman piece, Lonely Woman, although, excuse the accent, this is Lonely Women, looking at jazz, gender, and isolation, thinking particularly about the way that female writers and female musicians have thought about the often marginalized place of women within the jazz world. So a kind of amplification of a particular kind of loneliness. The third chapter, Out There, Jazz and Out Narrative, thinks about the way that other kinds of out groups have drawn on jazz to think through other positions of marginalization or social isolation. This was a particularly interesting chapter for me because it gave me a chance to think through the way that jazz has been used, not just in the US, but in places like Aotearoa, my home country, New Zealand. Several writers, particularly the Māori writer Phil Kawana, have written about jazz in a really interesting way, and this gave me a chance to think about that, along with thinking through writers in other places like Japan. Quite a few of you might have come across the novels of Haruki Murakami, someone who loved jazz so much that his first career was running a jazz bar in Tokyo. Then the final chapter, The Real Story, is where I turn to jazz musicians using writing, where I focus on jazz autobiographies, authority, and agency, with a particular focus on the autobiographies of Duke Ellington, and Charles Mingus. So that's an overview of my book and a little bit of an introduction to how I came to write it, some of the major themes that I'm dealing with, and some of the conceptual questions that I had as I was working through it. I'll now turn it open to questions from the audience. These can take a little while to filter through to me, so I'll just pause and see what you guys have to ask. There we go. Okay, questions have come through. First of all, the first question I can see is from Laura. You focus on loneliness, but were there other ways jazz figures were portrayed in literature? Definitely. So this is one of the decisions that I had to make as I was going through the book. There were several really interesting stories that I wanted to look at that didn't quite fit in because they dealt with jazz in a way that was completely outside of the realms of loneliness. And I think it's really important that both jazz musicians and jazz music do get used repeatedly in a positive way. This is also really true if you think about the way that jazz is used in poetry, but that was outside of my remit for this project. But one of the things that I would definitely say is that even in the books and short stories that I looked at, one of the things that you see again and again is that the loneliness of jazz musicians is often superficial. It's something that the audience or the narrator see on the surface, and then as the story progresses, that gets undercut by some moment of connection. So probably the classic example of this is one of the first short stories to really engage with the figure of the jazz musician, which is Langston Hughes's short story, The Blues I'm Playing, where we have a black pianist who has a complex relationship with an older white woman who becomes her patron. And their initially close relationship breaks apart as the story goes on, and the musician appears to be an increasingly isolated figure until the patron realizes she's part of a different world, and where she does feel connection, where she's deeply embedded in a community that is supportive. And the story ends with a final performance that brings together the patron and the musician in a relationship that's strengthening rather than just than either hierarchical or isolated. The same template gets used in quite a lot of short stories and novels even that write about jazz. Think about James Baldwin's story Sonny's Blues, which is about a pair of brothers who have become estranged when the younger brother's sent to prison. He's an amazing jazz musician though, and the story ends with the two brothers reunited at a jazz performance where the narrator watches his younger brother Sonny perform this amazing solo. But the solo is beautiful, but it's beautiful in part because it's connected to a large community. So I think it's really important that these musicians aren't just lonely figures. They're often ones who are actually connected to really important ideas like community, support, love, or often also resistance. Either resistance to oppression or resistance to social demands, often resistance to conformity. Hopefully that helps answer the question. Ginny asks, can you talk a little bit more about what you think draws writers to jazz over and over again? That's also a really good question. I think part of what draws writers to jazz repeatedly is that writers are intrigued by structures and forms that challenge them. And you can see this throughout the history of literature that, writers are consistently, not all writers, but, significant writers are often drawn to alternative ways of organizing their stories, telling things in a way that challenges themselves and their readers, that allows them to make different kinds of connections. One of the reasons that writers turn to jazz so often is that it seems to offer different structures, different internal logics for making connections. Sometimes this isn't so successful. I have to admit here that I'm not much of a fan of Kerouac or some of the other beat writers, and I think that their sort of professed attempts to turn the jazz breath into a kind of long novelistic sentence is less successful than some of the other writers. But you look at somebody like, say, Toni Morrison, I think he uses jazz form as a really successful inspiration. But I think the other reason that people keep returning to jazz is also that it is intensely moving. And that's one of the main themes of jazz scenes in literature, is that they're places where a character or the narrator experiences some kind of intense, profound, emotional experience. And it's often a way for them to reshape some of their own feelings as well. I'm thinking particularly about the way that a writer like Haruki Murakami turns to jazz, for example. At one level, it's a kind of badge saying this is the kind of person I am, but as his books go on, the music increasingly becomes a way to help the characters rethink what their emotions are, as well as experience deep emotions. Got another question there. Why focus on the short story when it relates to jazz? Are there options for longer works or even novels that focus on jazz music and jazz musicians? Definitely. And I hope, I might have been a little bit misleading in the way that I was talking about the book as a whole. I think jazz story is really interesting, which is why I take a chapter to think through it, because, as I said, it's one of the first ways that writers really engaged with jazz as a possible subject and also as a possible structure. Eudora Welty's short story Powerhouse is a really interesting example of a writer using jazz and a jazz musician as the prompt to try and experiment with a call and response structure that gives the reader something of the impression of a kind of group soloist dynamic. But the remaining chapters of the book, chapters 2, 3, 4, all focus on longer works, on novels or book-length autobiographies. In fact, I think that actually the times where jazz is used in its most interesting and complex ways are in these longer works. Thinking about autobiography, for example, something like Charles Mingus's Beneath the Underdog is a really complex response to the kind of cliched stories that some jazz stories became. So Mingus is not just writing about his life and responding to his own experiences. He's also writing in a way that responds to how other people, have responded to him. So taking those short stories and blowing them up, presenting alternatives to them that are over the top in the way that some of the short stories are kind of understated and pack things down too small. Let's just see if there are any more questions out there. I'll just say, while I wait to see if anybody else has a question they'd like to ask, that I don't think this book by any means was the last word on this relationship between jazz, literature, and loneliness. By the time I finished the book, I realized this was a much more complex topic than I thought it was, even after I tried to strategically focus it down into something manageable. So I think the next couple of critical projects that I'm going to be working on will be picking up on this. I'd be really interested to work more closely with some of the Sonny Rollins archives. I think there's some really important work that can be done with respect to this enormous body of writing. And I think there's still a lot more to be said about the way that literary works have shaped our responses to loneliness and the way that we imagine those experiences today. But if those are all the questions that we have, then I'll just say a huge thank you to everybody who's turned up live for this. You'll be able to go ahead and view this afterwards. It'll be on the LSU Press site. And I guess just to kind of let you know, you can also buy Blue Notes through the LSU Press website or through a whole lot of bookshops. It's out there. So I'd be really, really pleased if anybody wanted to buy a copy. Oh, I've just spotted one more question. What's one of your favourite jazz stories or one you like writing about in the book? Thanks, Patricia. That's actually a really good question. So I think a personal favourite, and maybe because it was one of the ones that I had read a long time before I started on this project, was a story called The Pursuer by the Argentinian short story writer Julio Cortázar. And I think that this is a really challenging story because, like so much of Cortázar's writing, it works on several different levels. But it's also a really fun and quite funny story about the relationship between a journalist who's writing about jazz and a really talented but complex saxophonist who is very, very thinly veiled version of Charlie Bird Parker. And the story probably has both like the largest amount of criticism of any of the stories or novels that I wrote about in the book, and also has the most conflicting criticism. People can't quite agree on what the story means. And I think maybe that's the reason why I found it so enjoyable to write on. I love it as a story, but it's also one that refuses an easy answer or an easy interpretation. Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. It's been really wonderful having a chance to talk about my book, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, and that if you do go ahead and get a copy of the book, that you enjoy it, find it useful, take something away from it, and if nothing else, at least get a good list of books about jazz that you can go away and read after mine. Thanks very much.